On a crowded evening bus rolling through the streets of Philadelphia, a quiet, one-legged black veteran settles into his seat, hoping for nothing more than a peaceful ride home. But when a group of rowdy teenagers, angry after a punishment at school, set their sights on him as an easy target, their taunts and jeers quickly escalate. What they don't realize is that the man they're mocking carries the scars of war and the weight of a past that demands respect. As tensions rise and the truth about his prosthetic leg is revealed, the veteran's powerful story silences the bus, leaving the boys and everyone else forever changed. The low rumble of the bus engine vibrated through the floor, blending with the muted hum of conversations and the occasional squeak of brakes as the Route 45 made its way through Philadelphia's Eastwood district. The late afternoon sun filtered through the smudged windows, casting long streaks of gold and shadow across the faces of tired commuters. Seated near the front of the bus, Henry Ellis shifted slightly, resting both hands atop the curved handle of his wooden cane. The cane wasn't just for support, it was an extension of him, a reminder of a past that refused to be forgotten. Henry was 65 years old, though his sharp eyes and straight posture hinted at a strength that time hadn't fully eroded. His dark skin was weathered, etched with faint lines that spoke of long days under harsh suns and sleepless nights haunted by memories. He wore a faded khaki jacket, a buttoned blue shirt, and neatly pressed slacks. Though plain, his clothes were clean, a reflection of the quiet dignity he carried. His left leg extended slightly straighter than the right, a subtle detail most wouldn't notice. But those who looked closely enough might catch the faint stiffness in his movements, the way his steps landed a little too deliberately. Underneath the fabric of his pants, a prosthetic limb bore silent witness to the price he had paid decades earlier in a war half the passengers had only read about in textbooks. Henry stared out the window, his eyes following the blur of storefronts and passing cars, but his mind drifted elsewhere, places and times long gone. His fingers tapped lightly against the cane, a habit he barely noticed anymore. The bus jolted to a stop, and the doors hissed open. A burst of noise broke the rhythm, laughter, loud voices, and the scrape of sneakers on metal steps. 3 teenage boys, Derek, Thompson, Ryan, and Chris, piled in, their presence cutting through the sleepy calm like a sudden storm. Derek led the group, his red hoodie unzipped and hanging loosely over a black t-shirt. His posture screamed confidence, but the tension in his jaw hinted at something more volatile beneath the surface. Ryan, taller and bulkier, followed closely, his backward baseball cap tilted at an angle meant to look careless but calculated. He leaned into Derek's every move, laughing too loudly at every comment. Chris trailed slightly behind, smaller and quieter, his shoulders hunched as if unsure whether he wanted to be part of the group or somewhere else entirely. They had just come from school, a long, frustrating day punctuated by a punishment that still stung. Their history teacher had assigned them essays on Vietnam War veterans, a topic they had scoffed at as outdated and pointless. Derek, especially, had taken it as a personal slight, venting to his friends about how it was a waste of time. Now, still simmering with resentment, he scanned the bus for a distraction, someone to bear the brunt of his frustration. "Check it out," Derek said, his voice low but sharp as he elbowed Ryan. "History's sitting right there." He nodded toward Henry, who hadn't turned his head but seemed to sense the attention. Ryan smirked. "No kidding. Think he fought in the war or just tells stories about it?" Chris chuckled nervously, but his laugh faded quickly as Derek took the lead. "Hey, old man." Derek's voice cut through the bus, turning a few heads. Henry didn't react. He kept his eyes on the window, his fingers still resting calmly on the cane. "What, you deaf?" Derek pressed, stepping closer. "Or you just too important to talk to us?" Susan, a middle-aged woman sitting 2 rows back, looked up from her book. She frowned but quickly lowered her gaze, her grip tightening on the cover. She wasn't the only one who noticed the young man in the back. Michael shifted slightly, angling his phone as if preparing to record. Henry finally glanced toward the boys, his expression calm but unreadable. "Leave him alone, man," Chris muttered under his breath, but Derek ignored him. Ryan grinned, nudging Derek. "Bet he's got war stories," he said. "You think he's a hero or just another guy who got lucky?" Derek took a step closer, his voice loud enough for the other passengers to hear. Come on, Grandpa. Tell us, did you save the world or just get in the way? Henry exhaled slowly, but his grip on the cane tightened ever so slightly. He wasn't afraid not of Derek, not of the attention, but he felt the familiar weight pressing down. The weight of judgment, of assumptions, of battles he'd fought long after leaving the war. The bus rumbled forward, the vibrations masking the growing tension in the air. Henry's silence only seemed to embolden Derek, who stepped even closer. Maybe you're just scared to talk about it, Derek said, leaning in. Or maybe there's nothing to talk about. Henry finally turned fully to face him. His eyes, steady, dark, and sharp, locked onto Derek's, and for the first time the boy hesitated. But it lasted only a second. Derek straightened, trying to reclaim control. Come on, man, he said. You can't just sit there and pretend we're not talking to you. You're not special. Henry leaned back slightly, his expression unreadable. What exactly do you want to hear? He asked, his voice calm but firm. Derek faltered, caught off guard by the sudden response. Something interesting, Ryan piped up, covering for his friend. Unless you don't have anything interesting to say. Henry didn't answer right away. He let the silence stretch just long enough to make them uncomfortable. Be careful what you ask for, he said finally, his voice low but deliberate. Derek forced a laugh, but it sounded hollow. What's that supposed to mean? Before Henry could respond, Derek nudged him lightly with his foot, just enough to make a point. But when he nudged him again, harder this time, the sound that followed wasn't the dull thump of a shoe hitting flesh. It was a sharp clink metal against rubber. The boys froze. Derek's eyes dropped to Henry's leg, and for the first time he noticed the subtle outline beneath the fabric of his pants. Wait, Derek's voice faltered. Is that? Henry didn't move, but the shift in the atmosphere was immediate. Whispers rippled through the bus. Susan sat up straighter, and Michael raised his phone just a little higher. Derek stumbled back a step, his bravado suddenly crumbling as the reality of what he'd just done hit him. Henry's eyes didn't leave his. Now, he said quietly, are you sure you want to hear my story? And just like that, the mood on the bus changed. The sharp clink of Derek's foot against metal lingered in the air, louder than the hum of the engine or the chatter of passengers. For a moment, it was as if the entire bus had stopped, the sound echoing through the narrow aisle and slamming into the teenage boys with the force of something they weren't prepared to handle. Derek's smirk faltered, his eyes darting down to Henry's leg again, now fully aware of what he had just uncovered. The outline beneath Henry's pant leg, sleek, rigid, and unmistakable, wasn't flesh and bone. It was prosthetic. Ryan and Chris leaned closer, their earlier bravado melting into wide-eyed confusion. Wait, Ryan muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Is that? Chris elbowed him sharply, as if trying to shut him up, but the damage was already done. Derek's face flushed, but he covered it quickly with a nervous laugh. Oh, he said, louder than necessary, trying to reclaim control. So that's how it is. Huh? Is that what you want, sympathy? Henry didn't move. He sat tall, his hands steady on the cane as his dark eyes stayed fixed on Derek. No, Henry said, his voice calm but cutting. I don't need sympathy. But you might need something else, perspective. The tension in the bus thickened. Passengers who had been pretending not to notice were now openly staring. Susan, seated just a few rows back, shifted uncomfortably, her gaze flicking between Henry and the boys. In the far corner, Michael angled his phone slightly, clearly recording now, his eyes sharp and attentive. But Derek wasn't ready to back down, not yet. Embarrassment burned under his skin, feeding his anger, and he pushed forward. So what? You think you're better than us because you lost a leg? Derek snapped, though his voice betrayed the cracks forming in his confidence. Big deal. What makes you so special, huh? Ryan, sensing Derek's desperation, jumped in. Yeah, you're just some old guy riding the bus like everyone else. Henry raised an eyebrow. Is that what you think? Chris shifted nervously. Maybe we should just drop it. But Derek wasn't ready to let go. He was too far in now, too invested in maintaining the image he'd built in front of his friends. No, he shot back at Chris. He thinks he can sit there and act like he's better than us. Like we're supposed to respect him just because he's old. Henry let out a slow breath, the kind that seemed to press pause on the chaos around him. "You think respect is something people owe you?" Henry said, his voice low but steady. "Let me tell you something about respect it's earned. And the way you're acting right now, you're throwing away any chance of earning it." Derek opened his mouth to respond, but Henry wasn't finished. "You don't even know what you're mad about," Henry continued, his eyes locked onto Derek's. "You're angry, so you pick a target someone you think can't fight back. That's not strength. That's fear dressed up as bravado." The words hit harder than Derek expected. He tried to brush it off, forcing another laugh, but it came out thin and hollow. "Whatever," Derek muttered. "You don't know anything about me." Henry tilted his head slightly. "You think I don't?" Derek's frustration bubbled over. He shoved his hands into his pockets and stepped closer, leaning in. "Yeah," he snapped. "You don't. You don't know what it's like to sit through a stupid class while they talk about wars that don't matter anymore. Or to get punished because you don't write some dumb paper about it." Henry's eyes didn't waver. "Wars that don't matter," he repeated, his voice carrying a weight that made Derek hesitate. "You think history doesn't matter because you don't understand it," Henry said. "But let me tell you something, it matters more than you'll ever know. And I know that because I've lived it." Derek opened his mouth to speak, but Henry leaned forward slightly, his gaze sharp and unrelenting. "I lived it," Henry said. "And I'm still living it. Every day. You think this," he gestured to his prosthetic leg, "is just some old injury. No, it's a reminder of what it costs when people think they're invincible, when they don't stop to think about the consequences." The bus was silent now. Even Susan, who had been on the verge of stepping in earlier, sat frozen, her eyes locked on Henry. Derek swallowed, but Henry wasn't done yet. "You want to know what war is really like?" Henry asked. "It's not medals and glory. It's dirt and blood and fear. It's watching your friends die in front of you and knowing there's nothing you can do to stop it. It's coming home and trying to live with the things you've seen and the things you've done." The words hung heavy in the air. Derek shifted, glancing back at Ryan and Chris, but they weren't laughing anymore. Henry's voice softened, but the weight of his words didn't lessen. "You're mad because someone asked you to write a paper," he said. "A paper. And you think that gives you the right to treat people like this?" Derek's face turned red. He opened his mouth to argue, but no words came out. "Do you know how many kids your age never came home from that war?" Henry asked. "Kids who didn't get the chance to grow up, to learn better, to do better." Derek looked down at the floor. "Think about that," Henry said. "Think about what you've got and what others gave up so you could have it." No one spoke. The bus rattled along, but the usual noise seemed muted, almost distant. Derek shifted uncomfortably, his earlier confidence now completely gone. Ryan and Chris stayed quiet, their gazes fixed on the floor, too ashamed to meet Henry's eyes. From the back of the bus, Michael lowered his phone, his expression thoughtful. Susan exhaled, her shoulders relaxing, but her gaze remained fixed on Henry, equal parts admiration and guilt for not stepping in sooner. Henry leaned back in his seat, resting his hands on his cane again. He didn't need to say anything else. The silence said it all. Derek swallowed hard and finally muttered, "I'm sorry." Henry didn't react immediately. He let the apology hang there, giving Derek time to feel its weight. Then, finally, he nodded. "Sorry's a start," he said quietly. "Now let's see what you do next." The bus rolled on, and Derek sank into his seat, his face still flushed. But the bravado was gone, replaced by something quieter, something heavier. And Henry. He turned back toward the window, his reflection staring back at him. Outside, the city blurred past, but inside the bus, the echoes of his words lingered. The bus rattled along, but inside, the weight of Henry's words seemed to press down on everyone. The hum of the engine felt distant, drowned out by the heavy silence that followed his speech. Derek slouched in his seat, his earlier confidence reduced to nothing but nervous tension. Ryan and Chris shifted uncomfortably, their eyes glued to the floor. Henry sat back, his cane resting across his lap. His breathing was steady, but his mind wasn't calm. Old memories stirred just beneath the surface, memories he'd spent years trying to bury. He could feel the weight of the eyes on him, passengers who had overheard the confrontation and now looked at him differently. Finally, Derek broke the silence. His voice was quieter this time, but there was still a stubborn edge to it. "So what?" he said, his eyes flicking up toward Henry. "You think that makes you better than us? That leg doesn't make you a hero." Henry's eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in something sharper, understanding. "No," Henry said, "it doesn't." The words seemed to catch Derek off guard. He blinked. "I didn't lose my leg because I was a hero," Henry continued, his voice steady but layered with something deeper pain. "I lost it because I was scared. Scared of letting down the men next to me. Scared of what would happen if I didn't do something. And scared of what might happen if I did." Derek frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means," Henry said, leaning forward slightly, "that there's nothing heroic about war. Nothing. The movies and books, they make it look clean. Like it's all about bravery and honor." Henry shook his head, his eyes darkening. "It's not. It's chaos. It's blood and mud, and fear so thick you can't breathe. It's losing people you love and wondering if you're next. And it's knowing, even if you make it out alive, that some part of you never will." The words hung in the air, heavier than before. Derek shifted, his bravado cracking further as he struggled to process what he was hearing. "But," Derek started, his voice faltering, You saved people, right? That's what soldiers do." Henry exhaled slowly, his gaze drifting to the floor before returning to Derek. "I saved people," Henry said, "but I couldn't save everyone. And sometimes that's the part that stays with you." He paused, gripping the handle of his cane just a little tighter. "I had a friend," Henry said, his voice softening. "Marcus. We joined up together. Trained together. Fought side by side. He was one of the bravest men I've ever known. And one day we walked into an ambush." Ryan and Chris looked up now, their expressions shifting from guilt to curiosity. Even Derek seemed unable to tear his eyes away as Henry continued. "There were explosions everywhere. We were pinned down, and Marcus, he took a hit. I dragged him out of there, carried him through the gunfire, and I thought we'd made it." Henry paused, his voice catching slightly. "But he didn't. I held his hand while he bled out, and there was nothing I could do. Nothing." The bus was completely silent now. Even the sound of the engine felt muffled under the weight of Henry's confession. Derek's face paled, his earlier anger giving way to something else, shame. "Is that why you lost your leg?" Ryan asked quietly. Henry nodded. "Shrapnel hit me when I was trying to pull Marcus out. They patched me up, but this," he gestured toward his prosthetic leg, "this was the price." For the first time, Derek's voice dropped the defiance. "But you were trying to save someone," he said. That's different." Henry's eyes softened. "Is it?" Derek blinked. "What do you mean?" "Trying to save someone doesn't erase the fact that I failed," Henry said. "It doesn't bring Marcus back, and it doesn't take away the guilt I carry every day, wondering if I could have done more. That's what war does to you. It leaves scars you can't see." Derek swallowed, his shoulders slumping. The anger that had fueled him earlier now felt small, childish. Henry let the words sink in before speaking again. "You think I'm sitting here judging you?" Henry asked. "I'm not. I see a kid who's mad at the world and doesn't know why. A kid who's acting out because it's easier than facing what's really bothering him." Derek's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. He couldn't. "You think picking on me makes you stronger," Henry continued. "It doesn't. It just means you're scared of being seen for who you really are." Derek's lips parted, but no words came out. His friend sat frozen, unsure whether to defend him or stay silent. Henry leaned back in his seat, resting his cane across his lap. "You asked if this leg makes me better than you," Henry said. "It doesn't. But it does mean I've seen things you haven't, and I've learned things you still need to learn." Derek lowered his head. The boy who had swaggered onto the bus was gone. In his place was someone smaller, quieter, and more unsure of himself than he had probably ever let on. The bus lurched as it pulled to another stop, but no one moved. Even the passengers who hadn't spoken earlier were now watching with rapt attention, their eyes flicking between Henry and the boys. Susan finally broke the silence, her voice gentle but firm. "You owe him an apology," she said, looking directly at Derek. Derek hesitated, but Ryan nudged him. "Do it," Ryan said quietly. Derek looked up, his eyes meeting Henry's for the first time without defiance. "I'm sorry," he said, the words almost too soft to hear. Henry nodded. "Sorry's a start," he said, "but the real test is what you do next." As the bus rolled forward, Derek leaned back in his seat, his gaze distant. Ryan and Chris sat quietly, their earlier energy replaced with something closer to reflection. Henry turned back toward the window, his grip on the cane loosening just slightly. Outside, the city lights flickered on as the evening settled in. He hadn't planned on sharing his story today, but maybe, just maybe, it had been the lesson these boys needed. And, in some small way, maybe it had been the lesson he needed too. Because scars didn't just remind you of what you'd lost. Sometimes they reminded you of what you'd survived. The bus rattled on, but inside, the atmosphere remained heavy, charged with the weight of Henry's story. The usual hum of idle conversation had faded completely. Even the rhythmic clatter of the wheels on the road seemed distant, muffled by the silence that had fallen over the passengers. Derek sat slouched in his seat, staring down at his shoes. His earlier bravado had been stripped away, leaving behind the raw, uneasy truth he could no longer ignore. Ryan and Chris weren't laughing anymore either. They exchanged uneasy glances, clearly unsure of how to process the shift that had occurred. Henry leaned back in his seat, resting his cane across his lap. His posture was calm, steady, but his eyes betrayed a trace of exhaustion, the kind that comes not from physical exertion, but from carrying the weight of memories too heavy to put down. Susan, who had been silent until now, finally found her voice. She stood up, smoothing out her skirt nervously as she turned toward the boys. "You should be ashamed of yourselves," she said, her voice firm but not unkind. "That man has been through more than you can imagine, and all you could think to do was mock him." Her words weren't loud, but they cut through the silence like a blade. Several other passengers nodded in agreement. "You don't know what it's like," Derek mumbled, though his voice lacked conviction. "You don't know what it's like to feel like nobody listens to you." Henry turned to face him again, his expression softer now but still resolute. "No," Henry said quietly. "I don't know what it's like to grow up with phones and the internet, with everyone watching your every move and judging you for it. But I know what it's like to feel invisible. To feel like the world's moving on without you." Derek looked up, his eyes uncertain. "I know what it's like," Henry continued, "to carry something too big for your shoulders and not know how to put it down. And I know what it's like to lash out because you don't have the words to say what you're really feeling." Derek's face flushed, and for the first time, his eyes betrayed something deeper recognition. The bus slowed for another stop, but no one moved. All eyes remained fixed on the unfolding exchange. Michael, who had been quietly recording earlier, lowered his phone. He no longer felt the need to document the moment. This wasn't entertainment anymore, it was real. Derek swallowed hard, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean to," he started but trailed off, shaking his head. "I'm sorry." The words were raw, unpolished, but there was something genuine in the way they hung in the air. Henry studied him for a moment, letting the silence stretch just long enough for the boy to feel the weight of what he'd said. Then he nodded. "Sorry's a start," Henry said, echoing his earlier words. "But don't let it end there." Ryan shifted nervously, his usual smirk nowhere to be seen. "We didn't know," he muttered. "We didn't know what you went through." "That's the problem," Henry replied. "You didn't bother to ask. Instead, you assumed. And assumptions, they're dangerous." Chris, the quietest of the three, finally spoke up. "We were just mad," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "We got in trouble at school today for not taking history seriously, and then we saw you and—" Henry raised his hand, cutting him off gently. "You wanted someone to blame," Henry said, "and I was convenient." Chris nodded, his shoulders slumping. "But here's the thing," Henry continued. "History isn't just something you read about in books or hear about in class. It's people. It's choices. And sometimes it's consequences." He tapped his cane lightly against the floor, the sound sharp but measured. This, he said, gesturing to his prosthetic leg, is a consequence, not just of war, but of decisions mine and others. And it's a reminder every single day that those decisions matter. Susan spoke up again, her voice softer now. Maybe this is the lesson you needed, she said, looking at the boys. To think about what your actions mean. To understand that respect isn't just something you give when it's easy but when it's hard. The bus driver, James Parker, finally weighed in from the front. She's right, he said, his voice gravelly but commanding. You boys crossed a line today, but you also have a chance to fix it. Don't waste it. The boys nodded slowly, their earlier arrogance now completely gone. Chris wiped at his eyes, clearly overwhelmed, while Ryan shifted uncomfortably, still processing the weight of the moment. Henry leaned back in his seat again, letting the tension settle. He had said what needed to be said. Whether they really listened was up to them. Derek glanced at Henry one last time, his expression no longer defiant but uncertain, like a kid who had suddenly realized how little he actually knew about the world. I mean it, Derek said quietly. I'm sorry. Henry gave him a small nod, his voice softer now. Just remember, Henry said, sorry doesn't fix things. Actions do. The bus pulled to another stop, and this time Henry shifted in his seat, ready to stand. As he pushed himself up with his cane, Michael put his phone away completely and stood too, stepping aside to let Henry move past. Thank you, Michael said softly as Henry passed. For what you said. Henry paused, offering a faint smile. It's not about what I said, he replied. It's about whether it sticks. As Henry stepped off the bus, the sound of his cane tapping against the pavement echoed faintly behind him. Inside, the boys remained seated, their earlier energy completely gone. Passengers began murmuring, some exchanging glances, others quietly reflecting. Susan sat back down, her shoulders finally relaxing, while Michael stared out the window, still processing what he had witnessed. The boys avoided eye contact with everyone, their expressions caught somewhere between shame and contemplation. Man, Ryan said quietly, we messed up. Derek didn't respond right away. Instead, he leaned back in his seat, staring at the empty spot where Henry had sat. Yeah, he said finally, we did. And for the first time, it sounded like he actually meant it.